Welcome to the Resilient and Resourced podcast, where you'll hear conversations with regular but strong-hearted people who explore resilience and discuss the role of resources and connections in their lives. I'm your host, Jeanette Adams, and on today's episode, Dr. Barbara Ward shares with me her experiences of resilience through a life filled with challenges and triumphs. And she does it with such clarity and insight. From single parenting, to running the Boston Marathon, to defending her PhD. She's had plenty of opportunities to lean into difficult times and to learn from them. Keenly aware of her privilege, Barb is a grounded source of wisdom and encouragement for those looking for resilience within themselves and from external resources. So let's get right to the conversation and prepare to be inspired. I'm very happy to welcome Barb to the podcast today. Thanks for being here, Barb.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jeanette.
So I'd like to dive right in and ask you about your relationship to resilience. So this could be historically, this could be the work you're doing now. What do you want to tell me about resilience and you?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about resilience when it comes to children and youth and parents and adults. In my work, I've been in the social work field for 30 years and, dealt with resiliency a lot, but no one's ever asked me about, my childhood or more personally, my experience with resiliency. And so, it's interesting to reflect from that perspective. And I'm in my 50s now, and so the era I grew up in and the family culture I grew up in, resiliency was just whether it was there or not, it just wasn't an option to not have it or come from that perspective. Like it wasn't an option to quit. It wasn't an option to complain about something. And if you did, it didn't make a difference, right? And I had 4 siblings, and it was kind of a fend for yourself thing, and definitely. A lot of independence in how we lived our lives as kids. Outside playing, we'd be outside all day, come in for lunch, and we'd be with neighborhood kids and stuff like that. So I connect that to how I am now today and about my resiliency, because it really gave me a lot of the ability to push through with things and not really reflect a whole lot on how terrible something might feel or how hard it is. You kind of just push through. Now there's downsides to that as well. And then personally as well, I was married at age 19. And then that marriage ended when I had a 2-year-old after 15 years. And I was so grateful that I had the resources and supports at that time to move forward in a healthy way. I was a single mom and loved it and thrived throughout that. You knew me for part of my life as a single mom, Jeanette, and I felt like it was easier for me to be a single mom than to be married.
That's interesting, yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people would say that, but it definitely fit for me. And so again, it made me feel very strong and really resilient to be able to thrive in that situation and really kind of come into myself through that situation. And then, of course, being single, I would do some dating and have some relationships. And some of those relationships, well, a lot of them, up until one now, didn't work out. But my approach to that is, as much as some things hurt or there was a loss or rejection or oh my God, now I got to start all over again, I always treasured what I learned from that person and that relationship. There was always something so essential that I felt I took away, and I didn't see it as a mistake. I didn't see it as a failure. It was just things that I learned about myself, or even things new things I was exposed to, new foods, new activities, new places in the world. And so I've always treasured that. And again, I think that builds resiliency, right? You're not stewing in negativity and in regrets. So I think that makes a really big difference. And now I'm in a relationship where we're very well suited for each other. We've been together for over 7 years. And it feels like all the important things are there for me. Like it's all kind of, everything had to happen to come to this, right? Is how it feels. Yeah.
Right. So all those experiences in your past were informing what's happening now to make you more
Yeah.
resilient.
Yeah, and then there were a couple other things. I've always identified as a runner, and I've been running for over 40 years. I started quite young, and I think running builds resiliency as well. So I had this kind of personal relationship with resiliency through my running, and it's still going on. And sometimes it's testing me more and more these days, and we can get into that a bit more later. But there's this internal messaging that you have to manage when you're a runner, about when to stop because of an injury or because you're tired, and listening to your body, and when to push through. Because if you never ran when it hurt, you'd probably never run. Like it doesn't always feel good. There is some effort and involved, but it shouldn't hurt. So I think that running provided a mechanism, to help me process adverse events in my life and adverse emotions, just through that act of running. But it also helped me to celebrate, and release positive emotions too, right? So it became a way for me to basically deal with life, pretty much.
Right. And that's amazing. You're leaning on your body's wisdom. So you talked about the internal messaging. It's like your relationship with your body and listening to its wisdom was part of the resilience as well. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd have to say, when I was looking back at, where I had to have my most resilience in my life, it was when I was doing my PhD and when I defended my PhD. And it's a huge story. And I'll just very briefly say, everybody's PhD defense is supposed to be a horror story, right? It's not supposed to be easy. It's a defense for a reason. But I really think mine took it up a level. I took my PhD in Belgium, in Brussels, at University of Brussels. And there's two defenses that you have to do. So one is public and one is with your jury. And when I went over there with my parents, my boyfriend, my teenage daughter at the time, so that I could defend, with my jury, defend then, publicly, and then celebrate. And what ended up happening is, that it got blocked by the dean of psychology at that university, because he didn't agree with international students, and I was the first international student to go through his program. And so he blocked it, and they had to get, a whole bunch of lawyers and stuff involved to say he couldn't do that. But it ended up that I couldn't do my second defense. I couldn't do my public defense, and so that all these issues were happening, and I felt like I just wanted to scream, but I felt like I had to be resilient in front of my daughter and show her adaptive coping. And I wasn't so sure screaming would be adaptive coping at that point. Not to mention screaming in a foreign country probably isn't a good idea. But then they sorted it out, and it worked out well, because then they paid for my boyfriend and I to go back. They paid for the flight, they paid for an Airbnb, they gave us a per diem for food and travel and everything. Unfortunately, my parents and my daughter couldn't come with me. But the day we were supposed to fly out for my second defense, was the day of the Brussels airport bombings.
Wow.
Yeah, so then we had to further delay it. So it was just like this constant,
Yeah.
pressure of trying to keep tapping into my resiliency and kind of
Yes.
letting it happen and letting it flow. So it was I ended up successfully defending, and we had a really great time in the end. But I would have to say that was the most trying time in my life. And I was saying that recently to my boyfriend, and he was like, "Really?" Like, he didn't understand how something like that would be so trying, given other things that I've experienced in my life. So it's just interesting what taxes our personal resources,
Right.
compared to others. Right? You never know. It always has to be that person's story. What they say is the issue for them, right? About that.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And what I hear in that story is how long the process went on. As I'm thinking about this pandemic, some people at the beginning, they were fine, and then halfway through they just felt like they were at their end. Now that we're going further and further, it's that length of time to keep digging in and finding that resilience.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. And Michael Unger, who is with Dalhousie University in Halifax, he's a resiliency researcher, or a guru, as I like to call him. And he gave a presentation a few weeks ago about the pandemic and resiliency. And he said, when we usually are dealing with resiliency, when we need to be resilient, it's usually when there's stress in our lives, and it's there for a while, it comes and goes, but then it releases, like it's situational, like what I just described with my PhD, right? It didn't go on for years and years and years. But what he says ends up happening with the pandemic is that it's always there, right? That stress is always there. So it's an issue then that kind of we're not used to coping with, and needing our resiliency day in, day out, like that, for going on for a year, like it is. So he says this is a new way of coping for all of us, right? So
right, yeah. What I appreciate about Dr. Unger's work is he focuses on not only the personal resilience we need, the grit and determination we need to make it through these things, but also the fact that we need to be resilient and vulnerable enough to reach out for resources. Someone can be as determined as they want, but if they don't have access to other resources around them, that has been very freeing for me in his work.
Yeah, it took me a while to understand his definition of resiliency. I really didn't get it at first, like years and years ago when it came out. But now, when I understand it, it makes so much sense to me, and it really does apply to so many situations. So Michael Unger, I'll read his definition of resiliency, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So Michael
that'd be awesome. Yeah.
Okay. Michael Unger says, in the context of exposure to significant adversity, resiliency is both the capacity of individuals to navigate their way to the psychological, social, cultural, and physical resources that sustain their well-being, and their capacity individually and collectively to negotiate for these resources to be provided in culturally meaningful ways. So what he's saying is that that resiliency isn't just inside of us. It's not just individual, but it's something that also the community collectively that we can impact. So it's about providing ourselves and others with resources and opportunities to help build that resiliency. Further, the research out of positive psychology with Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory says that we can store our resiliency so that we can lean on it in times of adversity, right? So kind of like how we use food, right? We use food as fuel. And if we end up not having enough fuel, we can use our stores, right? We can use our fat stores and our food stores to help get us through when we don't have enough fuel, right? And he says, Barbara Fredrickson and Michael Unger say the same about the resiliency, is that if we can really practice resiliency and kind of store it, then we can lean on it in times of adversity. And the way they say to store it and to kind of get these excess resources of it is to really lean in and feel joy and awe and gratitude and inspiration, to find ways to improve, being optimistic and things like that. So the more we can really be mindful in the moment and lean into those moments and value our relationships and being in nature and things like that, then that helps create those stores for resiliency.
Wow, that's an excellent tip. Like storing up for the winter, storing up for tough times. That's excellent. Great. Yeah, that's awesome. Earlier we talked a bit about your running, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to go into that story now about you dealing with the injuries of your running.
Yeah. So I've had some really serious injuries for the last 5 years with running. It started when I had a milestone birthday and I thought it would be fun to run the Boston Marathon. Um, and yeah, and I also said, I don't know, maybe that won't be so much fun. We should probably plan a trip to Hawaii as well. So we did that too. But I ended up, I qualified for Boston the first time I tried it. And then I ran it, a year after qualifying for it or so. Um, but in between that, I ended up getting a stress fracture in my foot, which takes over 12 weeks to heal. And then after 2 weeks getting off crutches, I dropped a barbell on the same foot in the same spot. And it didn't,
No.
it didn't break it, but definitely was another 12 weeks of healing. So I had to run the Boston Marathon without any training. It was the first time in my life that I hadn't done any running for over 6 months. And the doctor said, you can run it if you go slow and walk some. So if you're not worried about your time, then you can do that, which I thought, yeah, okay, I can do that, right? And so I did, and I had, a slow time. And so that was a new thing for me, was to enjoy the race as opposed to worrying about my time and where I placed compared to other people of my gender and of my age, and so that was a new experience for me and really valuable to be able to do that. But then I ended up having other injuries a little while later. I got hit by a car when I was on my bicycle a couple years ago, and I'm still dealing with some injuries from that. Every time I get running for more than a few months, my gait is still off, and I end up hurting something else. Got another stress fracture in my foot. That bone didn't heal very well, so I ended up with something called a vascular necrosis, but caught it early, so the bone didn't die, but it did eventually heal. And now I'm probably 2 months out of running again because I have a tendon issue in now back the other foot. So it's just kind of constant. And then I ended up getting a diagnosis that tells me my bones are quite poor and are at risk for fractures. So this means I've had to totally change my game plan for when I do return to running, that my personal bests are in the past. Right. So there's no more, doing the same speed drills and the long Sunday runs like I used to do, and the frequent running. So it's really shifted how I will use some running, and how you see kind of your times and your personal best, and how you always push yourself, right? It definitely is going to be more about leaning into the enjoyment of it. And now when I do get to run, even if it's for a kilometer, it's like a celebration. It feels so good just to run that 1 kilometer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so throughout those injuries, I also had to still find ways to be active and really move my body and find ways to be outside. And so I loved that challenge, especially at first, in the first few injuries. Now, not so much, but how do I swim with 3 limbs instead of 4 limbs, right? How do I use an exercise bike when I've got one leg and one arm out, and things like that. So it was interesting to kind of shake up my routine and still find it challenging to build muscle in the limbs that could handle some of that work, or try and find doing cardio when you're down 2 limbs, right? It's pretty hard to
Right.
do. But I saw that as challenging and exciting, as opposed to, really grieving the restrictions and the limitations that I had.
Right. So that seems to be a key. I keep that's kind of a thread going through your story, is that the way you view challenges seems to be part of your resilience, is that this isn't going to get to me. I'm going to find a way to get through this, and I'm kind of excited about trying to find a way to meet this challenge.
Yeah, it probably ties into what I said about my family too, where it wasn't an option not to have that approach, right? You get left behind.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. You once told me something about the way you thought about resilience was sort of in buckets. Can you tell me about that bucket analogy again?
Yeah. So the idea of buckets is more around self-care and resiliency. So we want to make sure that our resiliency isn't all in one bucket, so that if that bucket is taken away, then we still have other ways to be resilient and take care of ourselves. So an example would be the running and being active, right? If the only way I knew how to take care of myself and be resilient was through running or through activity, then if I'm injured or if I get really sick, then I don't have that. So it's important for us to find ways to build resiliency in what I call different buckets. And some of them, I'll just go through some of them here. So one of the buckets could be physical buckets, right? So how are we, how are we using our body to feel more resilient, to get stronger? How are we using our body to enjoy other things like outside or in relationships? And then there's an emotional bucket, right? And so how are we emotionally taking care of ourselves and being resilient? And if we are not getting enough sleep, then it's really hard to feel resilient, right? Because your brain isn't working in the same way. So we need sleep to recover emotionally and physically, right? I like to use the analogy of an ultra distance runner. So if you knew a runner who was running 100-mile races several times a year, you would say that they definitely have to physically recover in between those races, and that they would need a lot of sleep, especially in the week after the race, right? And we need to say the same about our emotional recovery with sleep too. So anytime we are having a lot of distress, we definitely need to have lots of sleep to help us cope with that and recover from the distress that we're experiencing. So the next bucket is psychological, right? So how are we psychologically being resilient and taking care of ourselves? How are we psychologically feeling strong and confident? What's our sense of self-efficacy, right? How much we can impact the world with what we're doing? How strong are we in our identity? How sure are we of what we know about ourselves? And how compassionate are we, right? Some of the things about self-compassion. So if we aren't taking care of ourselves and feeling resilient psychologically, then it's a lot harder for us to recover from distress or adverse events that we're experiencing. Okay. Another bucket would be social, right? This is being around people who get you and having that sense of belonging, that sense of connectedness, being able to reach out and ask for help, and being able to give help when we can as well, right? Sharing laughter with others, building memories, right? During this pandemic, I find that's what brings me joy and hope in my heart, is when I'm outside and I see families being really creative to still find ways to build memories and find ways to laugh together. Right? I see that every day when I'm outside, and it's like, yeah, you go. It's excellent.
Yeah.
And then of course there's spiritual self-care and spiritual forms of resiliency, right? So if we are not taking the time for self-reflection and self-awareness, if we're not feeling connected to something bigger than ourselves, if there's not something that makes us feel like just decent human beings grounded on earth, and that we're making a difference in the world, then it's going to be a lot harder for us to feel resilient and to take care of ourselves. Right? And so I'm not saying you have to go to church, but these are things like even, although that works too, but things like volunteering, right, and giving and helping others can make a big difference as well. And then there's a couple other buckets as well. There's a professional bucket where we can have resiliency in our professional life, making sure there's a life-work balance, making sure we're increasing our knowledge and not feeling stuck, or that we're not making a difference in our jobs, and making sure that we have connections and relationships in our workplace as well. It's not just in our personal lives, but those professional relationships are really critical as well. And again, the pandemic has been a test for us to try and really focus on those professional relationships and to maintain them, because we're not kind of doing the same type of meet and greets in person and bumping into each other face to face, right?
Right.
And then I also think, I also think resiliency can come from financially. I think financial, it could be another bucket, right? And so this is about being aware of your expenses and your investments, right? There's so many people who don't know how much money they make in their paycheck, how much tax they pay, keeping track of any investments they have, right? And so this is something that we would call like responsibility when it comes to the financial end, or what my daughter calls being an adult, right? She's always like, oh, I hate this being an adult. And she's 21 and she's still like, so how does the taxes work and what does it mean? And, so why do I have to fill out my income tax form? And, just kind of figuring all this stuff out, what she calls being an adult, right? We have to take care of these things yourself. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that bucket analogy is so clear. It is just a wonderful way. I find myself very often sort of in the mental bucket. If I could just figure it all out, if I could sit and think about it and make a plan and all of that kind of thing. And then some of the other buckets get a little empty. So it's very a clear way of planning to daily or weekly, making sure that you've attended to each bucket at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, I do find we kind of hang out in 2 or 3 of those buckets, 90% of the time, which, again, you want to look at, you don't want to make all the buckets even, because I don't think that would make for a happy and satisfied life. But we definitely want to see if we want to increase the others. And of course, if you don't, that's okay, right? We don't want to force that. But you do want to look at, if that bucket was taken away from me, how much am I going to have from the other buckets, and how satisfying will that be to me, right?
Right. Yeah. Awesome. So let's talk about your psychological bucket a little bit here, about your view of yourself. I think one of the resources that I have found useful for me is noticing and sort of expressing gratitude to myself for strengths that I do have. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect, as a teacher, when I used to be a guidance counselor and a teacher, students found this question very difficult. We're raised sort of not to toot our own horn. But I would love to know what you think one of your strengths are that has helped you in the area of resilience.
I think what I feel and what people have told me they find kind of striking about my approach to life is my approach to adversities. And again, what I was saying about when those relationships end, or when I'm injured, how I see, each adversity that comes into my life. It's not like I don't acknowledge the turmoil with it or the grief, but despite the challenges and despite the losses that it brought, I try and find the good. I keep the good, and I find how something has enhanced my life, and then I let go of the rest. Right? So it's post-traumatic growth theory is kind of the label for some of that. But then it's also about letting go of the rest, and it's about forgiveness and being able to move on from that. So I have no regrets about some of the things that people have done to me in the past that have been very, very hurtful, especially in relationships. And as shocking as some of them were, or as disappointing, and dealing with rejection and hurt and everything else. I've still been able to just forgive, move on, forgive myself for some of it as well, and deal with it that way. There's a famous quote that I really love, and it says, "Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the enemy to die." Okay? Mm-hmm. Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the enemy to die. So I ask, why do we want to carry this negativity around, right? But then a lot of people will ask me, well, how do you let it go? Like, I don't know how to let it go. And we know that positive psychology has a lot to offer for strategies for letting it go, right? Things like mindfulness, being able to visualize something and release it, self-compassion, right? Again, as much as I was angry at some of these other things that people did to me, I had a role in some of it too, right? Or sometimes you have to forgive yourself. If you don't have a role, you still have to forgive yourself for anything that you're sometimes feeling that may have contributed to being in situations. So I think that's being able to forgive yourself and being kind to yourself makes a big difference.
Yeah, I can see those threads again through our conversation and what I know about you. Those strengths, I can see that very, very clearly. Now, I wonder if you look outside yourself. What resources do you find that are outside of you?
Like resources that I rely on, like from my community, like collectively.
Right, to kind of,
Fitting with the definition of resiliency, right? That we've been talking about. Yeah. More the collective pieces. Oh my goodness. There's so many. So I have beautiful relationships in my life with my family. I treasure the relationship I have with my daughter. She actually thinks I'm a good mom, which is, it's such a treasure to hear that, right? I mean, now she will tell you all the things I did that are wrong and that she doesn't like, and they're there. But I have a really close relationship with my daughter, with my friends, with my family, with my boyfriend, and I really treasure that. But I also live in this incredible community. I have lived in Waterloo region, Ontario, my entire life. And I love to travel, love to leave the city, but this is one hell of a city to live in as far as resources and opportunities go for all people. Now, I also know that I'm a white woman and have had a salary my entire life that has afforded me a decent lifestyle. And I acknowledge that that's not there for everybody. So as much as the community has been really good for me, the community isn't always good for racialized people or where there's equity differences. And I think we as a community, all members of community, need to try and make that a difference, right? We need to try and make a difference with that and try and kind of eliminate systems that might be creating some of those equity differences. So I feel like it's hard for me to talk about some of my own privileges and some of this, this collective resiliency that has benefited me without acknowledging that some of it was because of my race, right? And because of my family and the situation I was in there with, having lots of resources and opportunities. But I was also a woman too, and so that has created situations where I may not have had the same resources and opportunities in my life as if I would have been a male. And so again, I feel like I've been blessed in this community and in my family with having really strong female role models and mentors in my life to help me learn how to move forward and how to deal with gender bias in a way without, without further harming the situation, I guess is a way to put it.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's powerful. I agree that we have both been privileged and things came easier. Since the Black Lives Movement march last June, the resources coming out of Waterloo region, though, has been exceptional. Online teaching resources, webinars, and that kind of thing. And I have been so grateful to have those resources that I wouldn't otherwise have had. So thank you for sharing that. One of the things that is resources I get are inspirational stories about other people. So I really want to thank you for sharing your story with me because that's where sometimes I get my inspiration to keep going and my determination is hearing from other people. So if you do have any last minute advice that you would give to somebody who is going through this pandemic again, kind of still riding the waves of grief and gratitude and really struggling, maybe, would you give any advice for them?
Yeah, well, following up on what we were just talking about, are there any mentors or role models who see the potential in you or who you can tap into, even if it's virtually, someone online, who can help inspire you and help you build strategies or new ways of being to deal with these adversities in your life, right? Can you look at what strategies are they using? What's their mindset and approach? Can you use any of it to generate something that might work for you, right? There's no shame in copying people when it comes to this. We don't have to generate our own things, but just look online or look in your family, look at, in the field, who inspires you and how are they approaching a situation or a skill or, something similar that you're dealing with. The other thing is self-compassion and asking, what do I need right now? Right? Just pausing and reflecting, right? The loving kindness practice is really valuable for this, and just reminding us that we all do face adversities and that we learn and grow from this, but asking, what do I need right now to help me through this? And how often do we forget to pause and we just keep plowing through, right? We just keep dealing with the distress. We just keep coping and you know, trying to be enough and find enough without pausing and saying, what do I really need, right? Yeah, and then I guess the other advice would be that there's research around how to flourish. There's research around what to do when you're feeling like you're just languishing and you're not being resilient. And Martin Seligman's approach to this, he's got you know pathways basically for resiliency. And I would say just to kind of look into some of those and to find which one grabs you, right? Is it about building stronger relationships? Is it finding something that you're really engaged in and that helps you lose a sense of time, like music or being in nature? You know, how do you build more positive emotions and really lean into love and joy and gratitude and, you know, feelings of hope? So when you have those glimmers of them, how do you expand them and hold on to them and possibly even store them for future use? And then also, what brings meaning to your life, and what gives you a sense of accomplishment, and can those be increased, right? So again, those are pathways for resiliency, is having that sense of self-efficacy, that sense of accomplishment, and doing things that bring you meaning, right? I know there's people that I've worked with and people in my life, they really struggle with finding meaning and having a sense of accomplishment. And they get stuck in depression and in anxiety, in part because there's not something that really grabs them and brings meaning to their life. And then because of the depression, it's really hard to get up and go out and find that. But when they do, it's amazing to watch how they flourish in it, right? It's amazing to watch how they went from not being able to get out of bed for weeks or months or years, finding something that grabs them, and not like they don't still struggle with the depression, but then it just really seems to bring some life out in them, right?
Right. Well, that's powerful. That's a really good piece of advice, is looking for the meaning. That's really great.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for everything that you've said today. I've been so inspired by the storing up. Like that was a new one to me. Storing up the resilience, the self-care buckets is also something that I have been, since we talked last, been working on taking care of. And then the advice you've just given here now about reaching out for meaning, reaching out to others who inspire you. Like I have a coach and a therapist, and plus my family, and you know, I couldn't do it alone on my own, no matter how much determination I have. So right. I am so grateful for your inspiration. I'm grateful for the thread that runs through your life, that challenges will not keep you down. There's something to look into and to learn from and grow from. So I just want to thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Danette. It's been lovely to talk to you and connect with you again. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and stay well.